Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome. Today it's going to be myself, Emily Brackett, and Maddie Purcell again. And today we're going to be talking about what's your big idea. This is part of a 3-part series. Last week we did about are you ready to start a business? And that has been recorded. And if you need the recording, I can make sure it's emailed to you. If you don't get it, just reply back to one of the emails you got to registration for this, and that's no problem. I'll send you the link. We've put it on the Branding Compass YouTube page. And then next week, same time, Wednesday, 12:15 Eastern, we're going to talk about build a brand that the market wants. But today it's going to be Maddie presenting what's your big idea.
All right. Hey, everyone. We'll just do introductions quickly, especially if you weren't on last week or you don't know one or both of us, before we jump into the process. So I'm Maddie. I'm an entrepreneur. I own 2 companies, Feud Kitchen and Portland Rising, and that's not what I would have seen for myself if you'd asked me anytime before I was 25. I grew up doing all these, like, in hindsight, entrepreneurial type of activities, but they were always on behalf of someone else, and I just didn't see starting a business or like forging my own path as a career for myself. And I got really stuck along the way. I went to school in Maine, went to college. First couple of jobs after school were totally unfulfilling. Like, there was clearly no path forward, but I knew that I could do things, and there were many different options for me. I just didn't know how to get from this like stuck, honestly, very unhappy feeling to actually creating it. So Feud Kitchen, and basically how I got there was the process that we're going to talk about today. So Feud Kitchen, just briefly, if you aren't familiar, we do cooking competition parties. Obviously, that is changing right now in our current climate, but we bring people together. The general format is beautiful professional kitchen, mystery ingredient baskets, and basically a dinner party with a challenge. So that I launched in 2016, and it was my first experience with business or startup, anything. Spent the next 2 years sort of figuring it out and learning how to run a business, and finally hit like full commercialization in 2018. Then in 2019, I decided I didn't have enough on my plate and launched Portland Rising, which is Maine's first professional women's sports team. It's the sport of ultimate. And you are right in the middle of our first season right now. We are waiting for it to become safe to play. But the lessons that I learned with Feud Kitchen helped immeasurably in terms of starting Rising off right, and like not making a lot of the missteps, not spending 2 years basically trying to reinvent the wheel along the way. So that's how I got to here. Emily?
Great. So again, I'm Emily Brackett, and I too own 2 businesses. After graduating from design school, I worked as a graphic designer. I got laid off from 2 of my first 3 jobs. I learned pretty quickly that the field was not as stable as I had anticipated. And the second job I got laid off from was in the summer of 2001. It was about July. And I took some time to just think about what I wanted to do next, do some self-care. And we talked about this a lot in the last webinar, if you watched it, or if you want to go watch the recording. But then I got it together. I was like, yep, I'm going to start my own design firm. And I made the decision on Monday, September 10th, 2001, which ended up being the day before 9/11. So I really know a lot about starting a business in a bad economy. I know it's possible. I've now made it through the 2008 recession as well. And More recently, I created Branding Compass. Branding Compass is a software. It is focused on helping small business owners discover the best words, colors, fonts, and visuals for their branding. And I will talk a little bit more about that process later on today. So before I turn it back to Maddie, I did want to let everybody know we're going to have time for lots of questions at the end, but I encourage you to use the GoToMeeting panel there and ask questions along the way so that they can get queued up and we can even stop and answer them if we need to. Also, you could, if you're having any problems, use the chat or the questions as well, and we'll be monitoring those.
Cool. Thanks, Emily. All right, so the before of finding an idea. This for me was growing up, like trying to fulfill other people's expectations and be good, do a good job, whatever that was. And there were too many different ways to do it, and I didn't know how to get to the end I saw. But I think a lot of people are experiencing that right now as options are changing rapidly, and the paths that we may have seen for ourselves long-term now look like short-term options, or there are options opening up, or it's time to explore that. But this can be a very overwhelming and frustrating place to be. Before we go any further, just to make sure we're talking in the right direction, want to do a little poll. This only has two options, just to keep it simple. It may not apply to everyone on the call, but curious if you are considering starting a business or just curious, pre-idea, still figuring out what you want to do, or if there are people on the call who are here because they are already starting a business or they have an idea they want to pursue. Make sure that we tailor the way we talk about this process for the people who are here. So I'm going to leave that open for another 15 seconds or so, just to get some quick feedback. And one of the things I learned as I look back on the time where I was in that like highway of question mark signs and twisting paths and things like that, is at first I thought, boy, I wish I could have skipped this phase because it wasn't fun and there was a lot of depression and uncertainty and things like that. But in the end, I'm grateful to have gone through it all, because I found this process that has now been helpful for me in many ways, and I've been able to share it with a bunch of people. And none of this is like totally new information, but putting it together this way is what helped me. But also it's perspective, and starting a business is not easy. But I know what it's like to be stuck and to be very unhappy in that position. And so now, even when, I think we talked about this a little bit last time too, but even when as a business owner you have to make decisions with not enough information, or you have to choose to allocate resources in a way that feels like you don't have enough to go around, or whatever the challenge is at the time, coming from that stuck place of uncertainty has given me perspective to be grateful for getting to do something that I really care about now. So in that very quick poll, we're like 70% have an idea and 30% looking for an idea as of now, and that's for people who are on the call. For people on the replay, either one could apply. Okay, so we're gonna address this. We're gonna go through the process from the beginning. If you are one of the people who already has an idea or has launched or is here for other reasons, feel free to sort of stress test what you've been thinking about through this process, and think about if there are ways that it really fits with how we're talking about finding an idea and then getting it to launch, or if there are small adjustments that might be appropriate for you to make at this stage. All right, so how do you find an idea? In entrepreneurship, we talk a lot about finding ideas as solving problems. And that can be helpful if you have a problem at hand and you're like, this needs a solution, I can't find one. That makes it pretty simple. For some types of businesses, it can be challenging to get anywhere thinking of it as a problem. For instance, Feud is very much, it's for fun, and people come for team building, which you could see as a problem. Like, we need a way to connect our group and get us to work together and have more fun and things like that. But for people coming for birthday parties or things like that, it's hard to frame like I need a great place to have a birthday party as a problem when you don't know what you're looking for. So finding problems, opportunities, however you want to look at that. What I've found is that the most like forward definition of creativity is as a light bulb. And it's this thing that goes from 0 to 1, it's binary, it's off and then it's on. And importantly, it's not necessarily something we have all that much agency in. Like if you could just flip the switch and get an idea anytime you wanted, then no one would be on this call. So it can be frustrating to like think of creativity that way and then be waiting for it to happen to you, and it's not a very effective roadmap either. So taking a step back, what is creativity? For me, it's not something out of nothing. It's instead taking one or more existing or two or more existing things and combining them in a new way. And those things could be literally anything. Here's our visual example, which probably no one has a problem that requires a light bulb with an orange inside. Maybe you do, maybe that's the new business. But the really cool thing about creativity in this taking existing things and combining them in a new way is it turns it into a process. It's not something that happens to you anymore. It's something that you can go out and do. And so there's 2 steps to this process, the way I think about it. The first one is noticing, which is fantastic because no one has ever had a noticing block. Like you can't get stuck and not have noticed anything in 3 years. We're always noticing. It's just making that active and choosing to apply it. So step 1, notice, and then step 2, combine. Super simple. It's not rocket science. And for Feud, there are a whole bunch of ways we did this, but one was we took the creative cooking model that had been limited to chefs, whether it was live or on TV shows or things like that. And we said, hey, anyone can do this. So we put amateur activities together with the professional competitive cooking model. Emily.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about, so I went to design school, and when Maddie was talking about her process, I was like, oh yeah, this is what we learned in design school. I remember early on we had to do a logo design project, and we had to come in with 100 sketches every time, because sometimes your first idea is great, but sometimes it's not. And like you need to plow through those ideas that are expected, and sometimes you kind of just keep ruminating on the same ones, and then you got to get through to the ones that come a lot later. As you're saying, you continue to notice, you continue to combine. My only caveat there is like, don't stay in this idea phase forever where you're just like never choosing one.
Yeah. And so where do we start noticing? If turning creativity into a process is something that's a new concept, and we haven't all been to design school or have that 100 framework in our minds, a great place to start noticing is with who we are. And so I call this the personal experience lens. And what this is basically taking our identities, of which we each have thousands, and just acknowledging that they're there and that they inform how we see the world. So demographically, who we are informs how we see the world, but our interests and our family situations and upbringings and all of these sorts of things are stacks of filters that enable us to experience the world differently from other people. There's this concept of the skill stack or talent stacking, from the guy who wrote the Dilbert cartoons that I think applies here. Is saying like there are so many great chefs out there. It's hard to stand out as a chef, but if you're a chef who does a certain kind of cuisine, like an extraordinary chef who is also American and has that lens, but then also oh, I wish I had more examples ready for this, but basically by adding different parts of our identities together, we bring a value that few other people are able to bring, which enables us to see problems that other people might not be seeing, and also to think of solutions that other people might not be able to. one of the reasons it's helpful to start with the personal experience lens is because it's much easier to solve a problem that you understand. It would be very difficult for a non-parent who like has no contact with kids to understand how to build this product that only a parent will ever need. And that doesn't mean that because you are the market for a problem, you know the exact answer. We're going to get into talking to customers and feedback and things later, but it's a helpful starting point in terms of recognizing opportunities. So when we're talking about personal identities, there are so many that sometimes we don't give value to that can bring a lot in terms of coming up with ideas. So I find there's a tendency to think of like professional identities and then personal identities as separate and not informing the other, especially if you might be moving towards a business or owning a business as a solopreneur or something that is like very related to who you are and the services that you can bring. They're not separate. You may be using one more than the other. But it's usually not just one identity that leads to a great idea. It's usually this intersection or this stack of different lenses. So on your own time, sometimes we do this as a workshop, but for now we're gonna just offer the opportunity to make a list of your personal experience lenses and consider the things that you would put on a resume, but also the things that you would not. Stuff from your background or stuff from your recreational life. And as you are moving towards a business idea or informing an idea that you're already holding with the interesting part about this step for me as I saw it more in retrospect, I did make a list of I think I made a list of 60 identities, and then I started looking for things on that list and where they overlapped and where maybe I had a more unique stack that enabled me to see things other people might not. But for Feud, for instance, so I'm a competitive athlete. Turning things into games with challenges really works for me. I'm a foodie, but I'm not a chef. So enabling me to have this chef experience was something I desired. But then another one that I didn't see at the time is I experienced social anxiety in some situations. And it's really hard for me when that's the case to do like an open-ended like cocktail party type of socializing. But I can always go play a sport as my social thing or something else that has an activity at the center where there's something to talk about and riff off of. And I wouldn't have necessarily counted social anxiety as like a lens that would be helpful in starting a business, but it really informed the way that that ended up going for the positive. So I would encourage you to make a list, at least 30 identities. And if you have an idea, consider which ones apply to what you're thinking of starting or what you've already launched. If you're still pre-idea, pay careful attention to the intersections between them. And then we're going to take one step back before we get into the action of actually finding the idea, which is talking about personal values. So if your identities provide the what of the idea, your values usually provide the how and oftentimes the why. And like we talked about last time in terms of self-care and starting a business that is going to work for your life, if you miss the opportunity to take values into account early on, you can end up with a business that ends up not being what you want to run or something you believe in, even in the more drastic case. And this is important to consider at the beginning because there are many different ways to start a business. And there are even many different ways to start like the same kind of business. And at the same time, there's sort of pervasive, pervasive stories about entrepreneurship and different kinds of businesses and things like that. And it can be pretty easy to fall into the default if you don't intentionally set it up otherwise. So the way that I have found this helpful for me is considering my core values. And I've gone through a couple specific processes to help determine them and make them very visible in my life. Like some of my passwords have acronyms of my values and things like that to keep it front and center. So especially in starting Rising, so we found out we got the franchise in mid-November and we were launching 3 weeks later. So we had 3 weeks to start a business. And my co-founder and I sat down and said, okay, what are the values of this organization and what we want to bring to it? Helped us accelerate every single decision since then. Do things a lot faster and make sure we were going in the right direction the whole way. So it accelerates decisions, and it can also help you take decisions off the table because you know where you're going from the beginning. Emily, would you like to talk about Brain Encompass's model or Visible Logics?
I'll actually start with Visible Logic. So I'll walk through how this identity and values factored into both of my businesses. So Visible Logic, if you're not familiar with our client base, we tend to work with B2B companies. We don't really work with consumer brands. We're really good at clarifying complicated messages. And I knew I didn't want to do like advertising for consumer brands. I just don't feel like the world needs more, throwaway consumer brands and spending millions of dollars on ads, even though there were people who came out of design school, with me who wanted to do that. But I knew that didn't fit with what my values. I'm also just, one of my skills is always like, hey, I can look at something and weave together, like, this is really the most important thread here and make it understandable. That's been a strength of mine. Fast forward to Brand Encompass. So again, bringing it back to this economic situation, I had seen in 2008, 2009, 2010, that small businesses were like, I want to start a business, but it needs to be really affordable. Like, I don't have the money to do this. So they were going to Fiverr or 99 Designs for their logo, and they're building their own website in Squarespace. And one of the models I thought about was like, well, what if we just created like really low cost websites? They're going to be, cheap websites and cheap logos. And I knew, I was like, that does not sit well with me. It's not something I want to build a business around. But I recognized that when I saw people doing that, I was like, oh my gosh, they're making this big mistake. They're jumping ahead in the process, and I can help automate this process of going through the foundational work of like figuring out your value proposition, figuring out who your client is, and really the basics of your visual identity, and automating that. And that became Brand Encompass. So that really fit well with my values.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point that like your business and yourself may have different values, but they're probably not in conflict with each other. Yeah. And so your personal ones can be a good guide for figuring out how you get there. One small value example of how it's been useful at Feud. So we do all these Insta stories during our events, and we sort of show funny clips from the competition and quotes from the participant chefs as they're cooking and all these sorts of things. And this brilliant marketer, super well-meaning fellow, wrote to me at one point and was like, hey, I think you should get Feud kitchen hats with Feud printed backwards like ambulance, so that when you are doing these Insta stories and using the front-facing camera, the people watching at home don't see your hat backwards. Like they see it as Feud in the front-facing camera. And it was something that hadn't occurred to me. I was like, oh, cool, more merch. Like, yeah, I'll consider it. And then I was like, hold on a second. Feud is all about authenticity and like playing at the sort of like polish and professionalism and gaps between like restaurant cooking and home cooking, or not cooking and restaurant cooking kind of thing. And so first of all, we would be leaving our in-person customers out of the loop if our hats were backwards for them. But also, if we made these backwards Feud hats, so if we made Do You hats, that would be the story. Like, we'd want to be showing these funny hats with the backwards Feud on them. That's who we are. We're humorous and we're authentic and we're like not too polished. And so just one tiny example of how values can help you find out when things that, seem shiny or fun, like new hats, maybe are or not in line with the brand. We have a workbook that we'll send out afterwards. There are so many different ways to find your core values and identify them and processes you can go through. Just share one that's worked for me. Would encourage you when thinking about values. It's challenging because there's so many good things out there for all of us to be. And it can be hard not to say like, yeah, I like honest and creative and intelligent and all of these things are my core values, but it's not workable if you're trying to be guided by like 50 different great adjectives. It tends to be most helpful if you can get into like the 4 to 9 or 10 range, something that you can like hold with you and use as actual guiding principles. So we'll send that out afterwards. If you have any questions about the process, feel free to ask. And so a quick recap of where we've come so far in terms of either stress testing the idea we have or getting to the idea. First of all, we're looking at the world through our lens as who we are in the stacking of our identities, our personal experience lens. This lets us notice problems and opportunities in a new way that either we haven't recognized as something we could solve or maybe no one's recognized. And I do think there can be a little bit of fetishization of like being the first one to consider a problem or the only person solving something. First of all, that's usually not the case, even if it can feel like it at the time. Like with Feud, still to this day, there's no one doing cooking competitions that are entirely participant-led and amateur. Like if someone is doing this sort of thing, they're like having chefs teach and things like that. But what we're doing is actually bringing people together, and it happens to be around food, and there are thousands of ways that that's happening. So noticing these problems and opportunities, don't worry if someone else has already found a similar opportunity. Your lens and your application, it may be able to provide value in a different way. And Emily will talk a lot next week about creating a brand and positioning that value for the market. So jot down your ideas as they come. Be willing to get past your first idea, especially personally, having been in a very stuck and unfulfilling, unhappy place for a long time. When I found my very first idea, I was like, oh my gosh, I'll light out, like, let me move towards this. And Feud ended up being my second idea, the second like big thing I was moving towards. But be willing to sit with it for a little while, and like once you have creativity as a process and are able to apply that, you can keep applying it. Like there are so many ideas out there for you that you don't have to feel, if you are feeling stuck, you won't have to feel stuck anymore. And then as you start thinking about things that you might want to turn into business, or as you start developing and launching, check in with your core values along the way and make sure that you are being intentional about what you're building and where you want it to go. All right, that's the pre. Now you found a big idea. Some people have, some people may be on their way there. Maybe someone had their idea on this call. The first couple steps. So for me, it was challenging pre-starting a business to find a roadmap for what to start and how to do it. There are a lot of resources, and it can be overwhelming how many resources there are once you have decided what you want to do or you move towards launching. So a couple of the things that have been really helpful for us, and personally, my first one is talk about it. I find with a lot of new entrepreneurs, and I was no different, I thought that the value was in my idea and like someone was gonna steal it if I told too many people about it, or like someone with more resources or connections would capitalize on it better. And first of all, if it's come out of this creativity process, then likely you see something about this idea that not a lot of people do, depending on if you're stacking a couple identities to notice the problem, things like that. But also the value of an idea is in the execution, not in the idea itself. And based on how well you understand it, you may be able to execute better than others. But for me, I've personally found every single time I was scared to talk about something and then I did, the idea grew like instantaneously, just from being able to talk about it.
So talk about branding compass for how I built my MVP. Am I jumping ahead of you here? Maddie?
No, perfect.
Okay, great. So people use the acronym MVP, and they don't mean most valuable player, they mean minimum viable product. So that the idea there is, what can you bring to market using the least amount of time and resources to just get it out there and test it. And so what I would encourage here is to think out, don't get stuck on like how this could be built. Like you only have so many skills and resources. And so for example, when I started branding Compass, I knew it was going to be a piece of software. I'm not a software developer. I had built websites in WordPress, and I immediately started thinking, well, maybe this will be, I'll build this in WordPress. And like I was really quickly like getting stuck on that. And I had to say like, no, don't worry about how it's going to get built. Instead, find whatever medium feels really comfortable to you. It could be sketching on a piece of paper. It could be working in Microsoft Word. It could be, Canva, Post-it notes, whatever. I just ended up finding, some online survey tools and printing stuff out and pasting it up on a big bulletin board. And so do it in whatever way you can mock it up easily, and don't get stuck on like the end physical deliverability of your product or service.
Another thing that can be a pitfall and an opportunity early on, depending how you approach it, is feedback. Feedback can be very valuable. And we talked a lot about customer discovery last time, which is the concept of basically including your customer feedback in every iteration of the design that you're doing. Is quite likely that the initial idea ends up being at least slightly different from what customers actually want to pay for and what brings them the most value. So it's an iterative process. But then there are many other ways to get feedback, and they can be incredibly valuable. And just a couple early resources that I want to mention are SCORE. It's free business consulting. I honestly could not believe that this resource existed when I started my business. And when you find the right mentor, it can just be incredibly accelerating and helpful. There's also the Small Business Development Center, the Women's Business Centers. There's a lot of excellent resources out there at low or no cost. There's pitch competitions, there's accelerator programs. These are probably looking a little bit different right now in our virtually distanced age. But then there's also just talking to people who are in the field that you're launching in, or what's the equivalent of getting a cup of coffee right now? I guess a Zoom call, or like a happy hour maybe. Honestly, just an email. So there are two mistakes that I see early stage entrepreneurs making with regard to feedback. The first one is the one I made, which is thinking that because like you don't have a business degree, you've never done startup or anything like that before, you don't know anything, and then taking all the feedback too seriously. And in my case, I'd say about like 70% of the feedback I received was very helpful and moved my business in the right direction. And 30% of it, I wasted a lot of time chasing suggestions and ideas and thoughts from people who just didn't end up really understanding my business. And it wasn't their fault. They were experts in certain things, and they had wonderful ideas, and maybe their suggestions could have led to another strong business. But for people who were in my stage, like thinking of yourself as very small and new at the time, there's a lot of value to putting a filter on the feedback from the beginning. Even if someone is an expert in their field or in something tangential, doesn't mean they're an expert on your idea. Then the other side, which I have seen peers go through, is believing that you know everything about your idea so much that you can't accept any feedback, which is not my experience, but I've seen it go negatively. And even if you have your filter pretty well in place and like you think you know what you're going for, it can be helpful with feedback to hear what question or what suggestion keeps coming up. Even if you don't think moving in that direction is the right answer, it might inform something about an area you're missing, or at least a way you could explain or pitch more clearly to move along from that. All right, and then the last thing, which we also touched on last time, but basically, I think of this as agency, which I know is a confusing term for folks from the digital agency, branding agency world. But for me, starting a business has been the way I've grown the most as a person. And basically every time my businesses have expanded, I have grown or expanded my capabilities or personal abilities previously. And the most overarching tool I've found to be able to make that happen is when I find myself thinking in terms of like, I have to, I should, I need to, like external things that I'm reacting to. It usually means that there's an opportunity for me to be thinking more creatively, looking for a third option and putting myself back into the decider or like agent role, the person who gets to do and be creative and have confidence in that. So for me, I have to has been a red flag in terms of actually moving forward and getting things done. I'll just drop that there in case it is helpful for others as well. So that is our quick and dirty presentation on finding an idea and implementing it and testing it, making sure we're going in the right direction. And we have some time now for questions. So feel free to drop those in the panels. And
Yep, drop them in the go-to webinar control panel there. There's an area for questions. Just go ahead and type them in there and we will start running through those. Just as a reminder, while you're doing that, we will, Maddie has a workbook and we will email that to you so you kind of have some worksheets to go through some of those questions about your identity, etc. And we'll get those to you by email in the next day or two. So we have the first question, Maddie, is they want walk us through how you created the MVP for Feud Kitchen, and did you charge people for it when you were doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like a lot of the MVP info out there is for like software type of design. So for Feud, the super early stage was I was watching Chopped with my roommate, and Chopped a cooking competition TV show, and we would talk a lot of trash and be like, oh, don't make that, that'll never work, or like, well, I would make X with these 4 totally random and challenging ingredients. And eventually we decided to put our money where our mouths were and try it ourselves. We had no cooking experience. We lived off pasta. And she bought my mystery ingredients, I bought hers, and we shocked ourselves with turning out like quite good creative food out of these ingredients that we really hadn't cooked with much before. I think sugarcane was one of mine. I'd never broken down sugarcane, that's for sure. And so we had so much fun, and it was such a cool experience to realize that we were better cooks than we thought we were, even without recipes or like knowing the rules. And then brought it to a couple of my friends. We started having like dinner parties that would do this. Eventually we had a friend's birthday party in a bakery that their family owned, and getting to see the professional kitchen, the behind the scenes, like use the enormous mixers and go in the walk-in for ingredients. That was like, I would pay to do this all the time. Getting the behind the scenes on top of this perfect social experience for me. So I did my first couple test runs in my apartment, where I'm currently doing this. Stocked my pantry with a whole bunch of ingredients I thought people might need, and I think I charged $10 a person. And I did 3 test runs in 1 week, and I was trying to figure out, like, do people want judging, or are people who aren't really cooks like fragile about getting feedback on their cooking? Does it work well as individuals or as teams? What's the format type of thing? So I did 3 of those for testing and feedback, and then I took it to Fork Food Lab, and I was like, all right, we're gonna go. We tested it in the professional kitchen and filmed the Kickstarter like highlight reel that same night. So I think I committed to moving forward maybe a step early in the testing process, but charging from the beginning is something I'm grateful I did. A, because it was expensive buying all those groceries, and B, because if you don't start at the beginning, then when do you start? So yeah.
Yeah. And there's a specific question. Did you like register the trademark for your name for Feud Kitchen? When did you do that, or have you done that even now?
Yeah, I did. That and a couple other administrative things though are something that like hung me up in the process way too long. So I'm grateful to have the trademark. Unfortunately, a trademark doesn't do a whole lot. Like for it to be valuable, you have to defend it. So if someone uses it, then you have to do court things. Sounds hard. But getting the trademark, choosing a logo, registering as a company, like was I going to do an LLC or an S Corp or things like that? Those are three things that I spent like months researching the pros and cons to that I should have just moved forward. And honestly, if I'd had Branding Compass at the time, I think there's a little plug. I think that would have helped me not waste as much time on things that were very simple decisions or just getting professional help in general. But yeah,
We obviously get a lot of trademark questions, Visible Logic. If you ask any lawyer, they're going to be like, register that trademark right away. But it is, I mean, you can do it yourself, first of all, or you can hire a lawyer. But even if you do it yourself, it does cost money. And I think, I would say getting like the domain names and social media handles are in some ways more important, because if you're registering a trademark, for example, and there's no domain name available, why are you paying for that? Because somebody else already has plans for it. And if you've already gotten the domain name registered, as an example, you can start saying, I started using it at this time. So I do think it's a good thing to do, but I don't think it's not like that critical first step, personally. So yeah.
Especially if you might want to end up changing the name or something like that.
Exactly. And when you're in this MVP thing, you should be, thinking about different options, seeing if it still resonates with people.
It is fun though when you get the official piece of paper and it has like the gold seal on it. When it's fun, but it doesn't. To me, it doesn't need to be one of the first couple things for most businesses.
Right. I would agree. Okay. Does any of this advice change based on this, COVID environment that we're in now? Anything with generating an idea, etc.?
Well, I mean, one thing that's changed is there are a ton more problems right now, or like people are discovering new problems that need solutions that either the problem didn't exist before or like it wasn't acute. But for someone who's thinking entrepreneurially, the opportunities abound. It's kind of just choosing the right one for now.
Yeah, I was thinking of the example of like a restaurant. Like it would be strange to me if you're telling me I'm going to do a traditional sit down restaurant right now, right? Like that seems like a risky endeavor and maybe not the best idea. But as Maddie said, there's still problems. Like the problem is people don't want to cook dinner every night. People want somebody else to cook something for them. So I think that problem, and like Maddie was saying, people are exploring this much more open-mindedly now, like whether it's pickup or delivery, or like even, a few months ago before the whole pandemic with like the box kits, people want to find ways to have their food given to them without being cooked. So yeah, I think about things like that for sure. Let's see, I'm just going to read through these questions here. Sorry. How long from coming up with the idea to actually starting a business? You can answer for yours and then I'll answer for mine.
For Feud, I think I started actively looking for an idea a little over a year before I started Feud, but I spent 6 months in the middle there on that first idea that didn't end up really being the one, and I wasn't talking to anyone and it wasn't going to go anywhere. So the idea for Feud, the time that we had the birthday party in the professional kitchen, I was like, this is it. That was in May, and then I quit my job in July, took a month, and started in September. So 4 months.
Yeah. So for Visible Logic, for me, I got laid off in July. I took the rest of the summer off really to mentally prepare. Starting a business like Visible Logic, which is a professional services company built off of doing what I did at my last job, like there isn't really a big idea there, honestly. So it was just like, okay, I have a computer. I'm gonna just start. I did start coming up with a name actually, and like just start spreading the word that I'm doing this. So it was only a couple months. Now, Branding Compass, I came up with the idea in the spring of 2016. I was in the 10,000 Small Businesses program. And what's interesting to me is it's still so mushy as to like, when did I start that? Because I had like the very first people who did a prototype test. I mean, I did Top Gun, the accelerator in 2017, and I was having people do that. So that probably took me still, I don't know, 4 months at least to build a prototype that people could do. But then those people weren't paying me. And then it was, so yeah, I'm just thinking like in my head, it was probably a year before I put it live with a way to actually pay for it. Because that's the thing, is like I was able to kind of prototype it and people could go through the preliminary experience. There wasn't a paywall for it. And then after about a year, I said there was a paywall. But it's funny because it's still really, in my mind, sort of an MVP, right? It's never done. I've learned that about software. So yeah. Yep, I have big plans, so still evolving. Okay, Maddie, can you talk any more about how you, when you're hearing feedback, how you're able to discern like this is good feedback, this is wrong feedback? Any tips on helping just figure that out?
Yeah, that's been a work in progress for me. And a lot of it has come from just trusting myself more. And I find in retrospect, I usually knew it wasn't the right direction or it was a bad idea to pursue or something like that, but I felt like I should or I have to do it anyway. Or like there was value somehow outside of myself. A lot of it has just been increasing confidence in general, and anything that has helped with increasing confidence and trusting myself. But those couple words that I should, I have to, those now I can recognize them as clues, so I don't have to like follow the wrong path before noticing. That's sort of like an upfront. It is challenging for me to speak to the other side though, if someone feels like they're in a position where they maybe aren't as willing to hear feedback, because I was overwilling. But for me, it's like the personal confidence leading to business, like better decision making has been a big theme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, especially thinking of Branding Compass, a big thing I've done is sometimes I've been in situations, and especially like if you were to join an accelerator, there's a lot of pressure. Like you meet with somebody and then they give you some feedback and they expect you like a week later to have acted on it. And you probably don't have that issue like if you're just doing this more on your own. Anyway, so what I like to do is like note it, but I'm not going to promise the person I'm going to do it, because that is I have to, is like, oh yes, I promise I will do this, and I'm going to come back to you like a certain set time to report back on it. Now it's more like, oh, okay, great, let me take a look at that. And then if it's something I'm hearing from other people or reading, that seeing that other people have experienced whatever, and I start having this like other data point that makes sense, then I'm like, okay, now I think maybe I'm ready to act on this. So that might be a good way to just, like if you're hearing it from more than one source, there's probably more likely to be some truth to it and it be valuable. So yeah, let's see. Sorry, got a bunch of questions, and we still have a few more minutes, so you're welcome to keep adding them in. Okay. Yes, we will definitely, people are asking, like they want to know more about Feud and Portland Rising. The emails have all come like through Branding Compass, but yeah, we'll definitely make sure that those links are clear to people how they can follow up with Maddie on both of those and support her two businesses. So when I think about Maddie, your Portland Rising, that seems a little bit more like Visible Logic, meaning like there's a set format. This is sort of an existing business model. And just like Visible Logic, like there's been design firms for a long time, whereas like Feud is something very innovative and Branding Compass is something innovative. So if you were to like choose one,
Mhm.
like what's the pros and cons there of having something that's a little bit more formulaic versus something more innovative?
One of the things I've noticed with Rising as compared to starting Feud is that with Feud it is pretty unique as a model and concept, and so a lot of the stuff to me feels very straightforward. Like, of course we're about creativity, of course we're about all of these types of things. With Rising, because their pro sports team is an existing thing, our values become more important because we have the opportunity to do it the way it's always been done or to choose to do it differently. Um, and so that's the pro sports thing. But even within the league, so Portland Rising plays in the Premier Ultimate League, and we have the opportunity to use our values there as well creatively. Pro Ultimate is pretty new. It's been a pretty gender balanced sport, at least comparatively, until 2012 when someone started a men's pro league and didn't start a women's or a mixed or anything like that. And we're like, oh, well, that doesn't seem to be moving in the right direction. So the Premier Ultimate League, founded in 2017 pilot, 2018 full launch to solve that problem. But there is this concept in pro ultimate as a whole of like being grateful just to be there, and like it's cool to be getting a little stipend for the games basically at this point. But we decided at Rising from day one that something that was really important to us was doing things professionally at a professional standard, and that meant paying for value and finding ways to have the funds to make that happen. And uh, there's this sort of like in between, where we had an opportunity to choose legitimacy and like making a big deal out of it rather than just making it the next step in the progression. I'm not sure I really answered the question, but
Some thoughts I had are if you're starting a business that people kind of recognize, right? Like I've been to a professional sports game before. I understand there's web designers and graphic designers, there's lawyers, plumbers, photographers, etc. When it's a known entity, you have to differentiate yourself like between other known entities. So that's probably your challenge, is more like differentiating among a potentially already crowded field. I mean, you don't really have competition in Portland, but it's like you're saying, like, how can you express your values to make it distinct? But if you have a very innovative idea, it's going to be, you said something, Maddie, that made me think. It's like, you may have to, it seems really clear to you, but other people have no idea what you're talking about at the beginning. So your marketing is more about like, what does this do? How does this help me? Like you have to start your marketing message way earlier and explaining like what you do and the benefit of it. Unlike if you're like, oh, I know what a plumber does, but how do you do it differently than this other plumber? So I think that's like a important part of it.
for sure.
We got the question of about how can you find pro bono lawyers. I don't know that there's any that are totally free, but like for example, in Portland, a couple of the law firms have startup packages. Do you know, Maddie, if they're totally free? They're very low cost.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to do one with Pretty Flaherty that helped me with my formation docs, like filing the LLC and things like that. That was free for me. There was an application that like mine got accepted.
Yeah, so I do know that we're both in Portland, Maine, but I do know in other cities around, they might not call it pro bono because that's sort of suggesting a different thing, but they often will have a package available either free or definitely low cost where they will like set you up either with an usually most traditionally an LLC, but sometimes they'll walk through the different options for you of S corp, DBA, sole proprietorship, LLC, and they usually have it and it's like a set price and it's pretty affordable. Obviously, they probably see it as a good lead generation tool of like who are the people who can be their future clients. So there's a benefit for both of you, and it is a good idea to start having a lawyer that you can call when you do need something. So I do recommend finding somebody who does it. And every city has probably multiple small law firms who are offering that inexpensively. So I don't see any more questions now in the chat. If you got one, now's your last chance. Otherwise, we are going to wrap this up. And thank you so much. We will send the recording. If you have friends who didn't get to go, join, you can share the link with them. We will include the workbook that Maddie mentioned with some some activities. It always is helpful if you actually take the time to write them out rather than just like thinking what somebody told you to do and like, yeah. The act of like forcing yourself to execute on it is always gonna get you better results. And then next Wednesday, we'll be back to talk about how you build a brand the market wants. So, we've talked a lot about in the first session, your mental state going right now. Is it a good time to start a business? Are you ready to start a business? And now we've talked here about how you can generate an idea. And now, how do you take that and make sure that it is going to attract people to pay you for what you are producing? And we're going to talk about like the visual branding and attracting ideal clients, et cetera, et cetera. So that'll be next week. Same time, 12:15 Eastern, same format, about 30 minutes of content and plenty of time for Q&A. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.